Hello, I'm Joey DiGiovanni. I'm here with Mr. Calhoun.
My name's Al Claudio. I'm the interviewer.
I'm Joe French, and Matt McBride is our filmer, and we're at Mr. Calhoun's house doing this interview.
So just to begin, what is your name?
My name is Paul Calhoun.
Okay, nice to meet you. When and where were you born?
I was born in West Dallas, and I was born on the 19th of July, 1949.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents or family background?
My father was a businessman. My mother was kind of a traditional housewife. She worked a little bit outside the home. She played the organ in her church. But it was kind of the traditional American family at that point in time in the 1950s. So the dad worked, and the mom stayed home and did all the cooking and cleaning and washing and ironing and all that stuff.
Very good. Where was your family originally from?
My father was from South Dakota, and my mother was born in East Chicago, Illinois.
What did your parents do for a living? Well, you said business. Can you expand on what your father did in particular?
Sure. He was an insurance agent.
Okay.
So he's an independent insurance agent. He worked for multiple companies. Yeah.
Okay. What was your parents' religious background?
They were Presbyterian,
Okay.
very devout, went to church every Sunday. And my father sang in the choir, my mother played the organ, so they were real committed to that.
Did you personally go to church a lot?
Until I was about 13 or 14, I did, yeah.
What was the reason for stopping?
The reason for stopping, actually, I think I became disinterested, and I found it kind of inconsistent with the way I was living and with the way my friends were living, and I found it boring. I would sit there when I was 12 or 13 and kind of squirm around in church and wasn't really interested in what was going on. So,
did you find any other religious affiliations more appeasing at this time, or were you still primarily?
Well, I would have considered myself Presbyterian. When we got married in the church, etc. I just wasn't interested in the religious services so much.
Gotcha. Do you have any other relatives that you kept in contact with growing up?
My grandparents on my mother's side lived a couple miles from us, and I liked them quite a bit, so I spent quite a bit of time in particular with my grandfather, so yeah.
What did you remember specifically about your grandparents?
Well, my grandmother was disabled. She had rheumatoid arthritis, which for the last 20 years of her life, she was pretty much housebound. She had trouble walking. She had trouble getting out of a chair. My grandfather was really my favorite relative. He was really somebody to go to, and I admired him a great deal. He ran away from home at 16, had an 8th grade education, and really worked in East Chicago in the steel mills until the Great Depression hit. And then he was unemployed for 6 years. So he really ended his life as a school janitor, and he was really glad to even have a job, because some of those people who went through that experience were just happy to have work. And he raised 3 children, and for 6 years of that time had trouble feeding them. So, but he was really one of the kindest people I ever met, and really bright too. He was very aware of world issues, and he was active in his union, so that he was a real committed union representative, and just a really nice guy.
Did your parents have any stories about their time growing up?
You mean like walking 5 miles to school and that? My mother, not so much. My father used to talk about his family, and he was born in South Dakota, but ultimately they moved to central Wisconsin. His father was a minister in a Methodist church, and it was in a town called Plainfield, Wisconsin. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Ed Gein, but Ed Gein he's the first, I think, documented serial killer in the United States. And Ed Gein was from Plainfield, Wisconsin. So my father taught his brother was a really good athlete. He was state pole vault champion. He talked about him, and he was really close to him. And he generally talked about how much tougher it was when he was growing up than he was on me. So he wanted to let me know that I should be grateful that he was really lenient, which was, in my mind, not the case.
Do you have any other stories about earlier ancestors that you never met? But
Well, I supposedly met my father's parents, but I don't remember. My grandmother, I think, died when I was 2, and my grandfather, his father, died when I was 4. So I really have no memory of them at all.
So how many children were in your family?
3.
Three. Can you give me the genders for the...
I had an older brother who was 10 years older than I was, and my sister's 7 years older.
Do you have any close memories of your childhood growing up with your siblings?
I have quite a few. A lot of them not positive. I don't know how much you want to hear, but it was a difficult household to be in. There was quite a bit of conflict, and so I was, as much as I could, I was out of the home, and I was real interested in sports. So I got out and I played, and I played a lot, and so. Home, my mother was really supportive, my father not as much, and there was a lot of conflict between my brother, sister, my brother and me, even though they were quite a bit older than I was. There were good memories too. I mean, we'd go on vacations, etc., and we had a cottage up north that I always liked going to, which I guess most kids, if they have it, like that. Until I was a teenager, I don't have real bad memories about that. But the teen years for me were pretty tough. So.
So, besides what your siblings were like, who were you closest to?
In my family?
Yes.
My mother, for sure. Yeah.
Is there any reason for that?
She was just really kind, soft-spoken. She was a really sweet woman. And she cooked, she fed me, ironed all my clothes, took care of me. There wasn't much not to like, really.
Could you describe the house you grew up in? Maybe even your room?
Well, it was in West Dallas. At that time, they built the house, and I think they moved into it when I was about 8 months old. And it was still, there were lots of woods out there. And it was almost like, it was just in development. And it was, West Dallas was kind of an extension of Milwaukee as opposed to a suburb in a lot of ways. So there were a lot of starter homes out there, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom homes that were really small. And a lot of people that lived in those homes worked in the factories that were in West Dallas, which there were a lot of at that time. And you could, for instance, there was a factory called Alice Chalmers, which employed, I think, 12,000 people. And I would guess that probably one of every 3 people that you would meet, father worked at Alice Chalmers. And my wife's father worked there too. He was an engineer. So, and he had immigrated here from China. So, yeah, I mean, our house was kind of bigger than other ones. And it was a nice house. I mean, my room was pretty nondescript. I didn't spend much time in it other than sleeping. So it wasn't a place that like I made my own, like I didn't have posters on the wall, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if there were even posters at that time. I had a lot of baseball cards, and used to trade them, et cetera. But it was a house. He left around the time of the Chinese Revolution. Whether he left before or after, I'm not sure. But he told stories about running from the Japanese during World War II. And he escaped from them on the roof of a train. He and a whole bunch of other people, there was a cholera outbreak on the train itself. So he could just have well have died. But he came here, I believe, to work at Alice Chalmers. And his future wife was then a student at Marquette. And her family was interesting because they had been Catholic in China from the time of Marco Polo. So that her father was an architect and was trained in Paris. And so all or most of the Catholic churches in Shanghai he designed. So he was very wealthy. And so the house that my wife's mother grew up in is still there. And my wife saw it, I think 10 years ago or so, and there were like 8 or 9 families living in that. So it was really a big house.
If you feel comfortable, could you describe your family's economic circumstances?
I would call it middle class. I mean, yeah.
So what duties did you have as a child? Any chores?
Oh, nothing unusual. I'd cut the grass. I wasn't real good at it. I wasn't good at chores. But I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. I was sort of expected to play baseball and basketball and football. That was kind of what they wanted me to do. At least that's what my father wanted me to do. And I don't think I had a lot of responsibilities. I was kind of a spoiled kid in a lot of ways. I was a baby of the family. I was much younger than everybody else. So there were, in terms of like domestic chores around the house, etc., there wasn't much expected of me.
If you did do chores, did you have an incentive to do it?
You mean to get an allowance?
Yes.
No, I think they just gave me money once in a while. I don't recall having an official allowance.
Did you at all learn to cook?
No, nothing. No, that wasn't expected. I mean, that just wasn't expected. My father didn't cook very often. That was really my mother's job, essentially. I mean, he cooked once in a while. He'd make eggs or something like that, but it was rare. That, no, it was a very structured environment in that way. In other words, there were expectations of the woman, there were expectations of the husband, and that's the way it was.
Was there any conflict in that structure? Did your mother want to work at all, or was she?
Well, she worked a little bit, part-time. I mean, she was in the church playing the organ, and there was a funeral home that she would play the organ at some funerals for.
So what activities did your family do? Any vacations that you memorized?
Well, primarily, they really liked it. My grandfather on my father's side had built that cabin. It's still there in 1931, right after the crash, which is interesting. And it was just basically a shack that's been expanded a little bit, but the basic structure is still there. And that was the extent of what we really did, like during the summer. If in the winters, we really didn't do that much as a family. My father was always taking me to basketball games, etc., to watch. But that was pretty much it.
Could you talk about a little bit about your education and maybe the diversity of schools that
Well, I went to public schools. I think they were good. I mean, I don't think they were great schools, but they were fine and certainly adequate in terms of what they offered. I went to school in West Dallas. I went to, the first school was Johnson School. It was 1 through 8. Then I went for a year to what they called junior high school at that time. And then I went to Nathan Hale High School. And that was it. I was not a terrific student. I was really more interested in things outside of school, more so than academics.
Was that like sports?
That was like sports, yeah.
Gotcha. On all the sports that you played, what was your absolute passion?
I was better at baseball. I liked basketball more, but I was better at baseball, and ultimately that's what I played. And that's what got me into college, actually.
So what did you do on holidays like Christmas, Thanksgiving, your birthdays? Was it very celebrated?
Christmas was the same every year. My mother had a sister And we would either, on alternating years, we would go to her house, and then the other year they would come to our house. We always ate the same things. And I think it was pretty much a traditional Christmas. It was actually kind of boring. Yeah, we would go to church. We would go to church on Christmas Eve. And then we would go to either my aunt's house or come to our house. And we would have ice cream and cake. And people would talk a little bit for about 45 minutes, and then we'd go home. And then I would go to bed, and I would look forward to the morning, especially when I was little, because Santa Claus was coming and he had lots of stuff for me,
Were there any particular meals that you really remember?
It was always roast beef or ham. Every now and then a chicken was thrown in. But pretty much on Sundays, we always had a big meal after church. And generally speaking, that was roast beef. And that was a nice meal. It was like a dinner. It's kind of a formal dinner.
So going back to community, could you quickly describe the community that you lived in?
Oh, it was really working class. I mean, my father was unusual. Most of the people, although our neighbor was a physician, but for instance, there was a neighbor next door. I can't recall. He worked in some factory in West Dallas. Another guy 2 doors down worked in Miller Brewing. I'm trying to remember, but the majority of the people kind of worked in factories. Some of them machinists, some of them, higher end, some might have been engineers. But for the most part, people in West Dallas worked at Allis Chalmers, or they worked at Press Steel Tank, or they worked at Ryerson Steel, etc. And that's the way it was. It was I think it was a lot of people who for the first time were homeowners. And they had these little houses. There were whole neighborhoods where the houses all looked the same. The structure was the same. One might be turned this way or that way, but they all looked pretty much the same.
Could you talk about the diversity of race in your community?
There was none. It was white. There might have been a few Latinos. My wife's family came into West Dallas. They were one of the few Asian families there. And when she moved here, she experienced a lot of racism. So it was unusual for you to see ethnic diversity. The first time that I interacted with African Americans was in high school playing basketball. When we played Milwaukee Lincoln, which was like at that time, they won the state championship 3 years in a row. And they were incredible. I mean, they were so good. And for a high school team, in my senior year, I think they averaged 108 points a game, which is a lot for a high school basketball team. And 2 of them went on to play professionally. So it was like more than playing a game against them, you were sort of watching them play. I mean, they were just so much better than we were. They were quicker and they were better coached, and it was interesting. It was really interesting. And one of the players, Fred Brown, finished his career, I think, with the Seattle Supersonics, and they called him Downtown Freddie Brown. And he could really shoot. He was just a great player.
That experience when you first met those African American kids, was it very eye-opening for you?
It was more eye-opening for me earlier on, and I don't even know how old I was. I might have been 11 or 12, and for whatever reason, my father took a ride through the ghetto. And I was astounded. I mean, I was just astounded at the poverty in terms of the way I was growing up and the difference. And just the way the neighborhood looked and all the people in the street, and clear poverty. And it made a real impression on me. I never said anything about it to him, but I was just astounded at, in the same city, there were people living on a totally different level.
Could you describe your places that you shopped, and then?
Well, there was a little downtown area in West Dallas, and there was J.C. Penney's that my mother was fond of shopping at, and then there was, I believe there was a Sears, and then there was a little sports store that we went to a lot, and it was pretty local. In other words, there were small businesses. We went to the same barbershop all the time. And it was quite a bit different than now. There were no big stores until, I think the first big store that opened up was called Atlantic Mills. And that would be kind of comparable to Mills Fleet Farm, or, yeah, that's the kind of store it was. Where you'd go in there, it was supposedly cheaper, and it was cheaper. And a lot of the goods were imported at that time from Japan, so that they cost less than American-made things. And you would go there if there was something you needed and you didn't want to pay so much money.
So compared to the neighborhood with the shops and the schools and the more of the ghetto area, did that at all shape your political viewpoint?
Absolutely, yeah. Certainly, I became aware of racism, and as I was growing up, I graduated from high school in '67. So within a 3-year span, Bobby Kennedy had died, Martin Luther King had died, I believe Malcolm X had died, all assassinated. John Kennedy was shot when I was in 9th grade, which was, I mean, everything stopped when that happened. I was in English class, I can remember it. And he was a really strange English teacher. He used to call the wastebasket the circular for random. And he was just an odd man, but I remember the moment it came over the loudspeaker system that President Kennedy had been shot, and people were just stunned. And there were just lots of, it was a violent period of time. I mean, we were in the midst of the Vietnam War. That was coming over the nightly news, and we were seeing things like graphic violence. And there were always death tolls. At the end of the week, they would say 55 American soldiers that died, and it was always far more Vietnamese. They would say 200, 500, etc. And I mean, looking back on it now, they weren't really clear how many people were dying in terms of Vietnamese. So it was, I think, to a certain extent, a fictitious number to make it seem like we were winning that war. But it became really clear, especially in 1968, that we weren't winning, and we probably never would win. It was during a time called the Tet Offensive. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But that's when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army came into Saigon and really held us at a standstill for a period of days. And that was a real eye-opener for both the military and the politicians. And so, yeah, it shaped me a lot. And racism was combined with that. That was the heart of the civil rights movement. There were people marching. And there were people marching here in the early 60s, in mid-60s for open housing. In other words, the area in Milwaukee where African Americans could live was very small. And they couldn't live anyplace else. In other words, the marches that were in Milwaukee were for open housing, so that African Americans could move perhaps as far north as North Avenue, right? And the African American neighborhood was called Bronzeville, and it was an actual community where there were doctors and lawyers. And I mean, I know people who grew up in that community, and there's a group of people that still meets every second Saturday. People who grew up in Bronzeville, and they meet because they've developed these bonds that have lasted them a lifetime. But at a certain point, there was urban renewal because it was substandard housing, and even though it was substandard housing, it was still viewed as a community. But at a certain point in the time period, and I should know it, 70, 71, they knocked down 6,000 houses. And some people had to literally leave the city because there was no place for them to go. And so that was for urban renewal. There was also talk of the freeway, I-43, running a spur going down Walnut Street towards the lake. And so if you notice there now, if you drive there are some large warehouse-type buildings. There's a school that's still there, but all the houses are gone. There's a housing project, I believe it's on 5th and Walnut. But that was the African American community that was pretty much destroyed.
So I know you talked about your English teacher during the JFK assassination. Was that your favorite subject?
Oh, no.
No.
No. I don't know that when I was in junior high school I had a favorite subject. My favorite subject. In middle school, I wasn't very interested in school until I was a senior. And I started getting worried about graduating, actually. And part of the reason for that was the Vietnam War. That if you didn't go to college, you were going to get drafted and you were going to go into the military. And people who were a year or two older than me started coming back. A number of them either physically disabled or psychologically disabled, and some people were getting killed. So that we were very aware of that, and there was a budding resistance to the draft and to the war, for sure. And so I kind of woke up, and I said, I've got to make some choices here. I'm not really interested in fighting in the war in Vietnam. And part of that was what I was seeing coming through print media and mass media, the television. And to me, it was really appalling. And I never could figure out a rationale for this war, and I still don't, to this day, understand. I know why they said we were fighting it, but I don't know what it accomplished. And I don't think the people who, Robert McNamara, who was Lyndon Johnson's, I believe, Secretary of Defense, really at the end of his life said he wasn't sure why we were fighting there. So, and Johnson ultimately didn't rerun for a second term because of the Vietnam War, because he was uncomfortable with what was happening there.
So after high school, did you serve in the military?
No,
How did you avoid
I went to college. And then for the first 2 years, if you were in school and you maintained a 2.0 grade point average, you stayed out of the draft. Then they started what was called a lottery, so that you would get a draft number. And mine was 247. So the first year I was eligible for the draft, they went to, I believe, 195. So you were only eligible for that 1 year. So they didn't get to my number, so I wasn't drafted.
Do you have any experiences with friends at all that went into the military?
Sure.
Could you describe?
I can describe two. One was, I played baseball with him. He was a pitcher. His name was Bob Wieland. And he was drafted by the Army and the Philadelphia Phillies in the same week. And obviously the Army's call was stronger. And so he went through training. He went and he became a medic. He went to Vietnam. He was there 10 days and stepped on a landmine. Lost one leg below the knee and the other one at the hip. And came back. And they told him if he got enough upper body strength, he would be able to be fitted with artificial legs. So he lifted weights, and he got to the point where he was 245 pounds without legs. And he was built just like a V. But that wasn't sufficient for him to be able to walk with artificial legs, so he subsequently has run the New York Marathon on his hands, with plates on his hands. Took him a day and a half. He's walked across the country on his hands. So another friend that I recall, his name was Paul Tilley. He went to Marquette for a couple of years, and then he came out to West Dallas to go, I think, his senior year. And he was drafted. He was from a really big family, I think 12 kids. And he came back and he was crazy. I don't know if that's a real clinical description of it, but he used to go out at night in West Dallas and play war. Not carrying guns, but he would act as if he were still in the bush in Vietnam. And so he really, I guess it would be an early case that what we describe now as PTSD. And so ultimately, I didn't see him a lot. I saw him a few times after he came back from Vietnam. But then he got married, moved to northern Wisconsin, and People aren't really clear, but he went off one night on a boat. He was living on water, and they didn't find him. They found him next spring, either drowned or frozen to death in the ice. And nobody's clear whether he committed suicide or whether it was just an accident. But I recall him as a really nice kid who definitively was changed by that experience.
So based off of those two stories, how were you changed by their role, pretty much? Like,
Well, I got involved in the anti-war movement, as a lot of people did. And so at one point I went on a fast for 40 days in protest of the Vietnam War. I did some public speaking. During that fast, I went to a Democratic fundraiser. George McGovern was running for president against Nixon at that time. And I think George McGovern won one state and the District of Columbia. So it was a real landslide. But he was the peace candidate. And so we went to a fundraiser for him. I think there were 4 or 5 of us, and you know, with those fundraisers, they have nice dinners, steaks, etc. So we sat there and didn't eat. And he came over to our table. During his speech, he mentioned us, and he came over to our table and introduced himself. A really nice man, just a really nice man. But he didn't have a chance in the election, the general election.
do you have any other experiences with people you met?
At that time, not really, but it was just all around us. I mean, the 1968 Democratic Convention, the 68 Convention, I mean, I can't recall what year Kent State was. Do you know about Kent State? That's when 4 students were shot to death while they were protesting the war. And it was just an issue that kind of occupied our everyday life. It was just with us all the time. So a lot of my college classmates were involved in the same things I was.
Could you talk a little bit about your public speaking?
My public speaking?
In the anti-war.
Oh, in the anti-war, I pretty much spoke. I spoke on television a couple times, especially during that fast. Yeah, they came and interviewed us, you know, about what we'd done. I think most people thought we were kind of lunatics, which is probably the case. But yeah, and I spoke in small groups and stuff. It wasn't like I was standing at Milwaukee County, well, it was a Milwaukee County Stadium and speaking to 40,000 people, you know.
Very cool. So after college, did you have any jobs?
I did.
Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Actually, right out of college, I got a job driving a school bus, one of those big yellow school buses. It was kind of cool. I liked it, and I don't know if there wasn't a lot of work at that time or not, but I did that sort of part time for 6 or 8 months, and I drove for a school bus for this school for disabled kids on the east side of Milwaukee called Gensland School. I really enjoyed it because I got to like the kids a lot, and I interacted with the kids and got to know them. But then I got into, I was accepted into a program called VISTA, which was Volunteers in Service to America. And so then I moved to Denver, Colorado, and I worked out there as a community organizer, which is what Obama did for a while. And so what I was involved with was substandard housing in Denver. And when we first got there, there were lots and lots of young people. I think there were probably 30 or 40 young people that came to work on the same project. Some doing housing rehabilitation, but I was assigned to do political stuff. But there was nothing for us to do, really. There was no organization, there was no structure, there was no nothing, and so we had to develop our own structure. So we organized, we did a petition drive So I can't recall how many signatures we had to get it on the ballot. But we spent the majority of the year getting signatures and developing legislation to be put on the ballot in Denver. And in that process, probably the most memorable thing in that process is that's really when I started to get into photography, which what I do now. My wife had given me a camera, so we needed some pictures. So I was going into houses and taking pictures of things that were below housing code in Denver. And so what was interesting is we found a whole group of houses that were really not in good shape. And so we looked for the owners of the houses. Well, the owners of the houses was Children's Hospital in Denver. So they had purchased all this land for future expansion and had not taken good care of the houses that people were living in. And so I don't remember, but a TV crew came out there from local news there. And then the people from Children's Hospital had to answer for this substandard housing that they owned and weren't repairing. And then we got enough signatures to get it on the ballot, but there was a group that put a referendum on the ballot that essentially neutralized all of the legislative effort we were making. So they both won. So what it meant was ours won, but theirs won too. So their legislation essentially meant that all the effort we'd put into doing all of that was for nothing. But the community organizing part of it, I really disliked. I really didn't like it at all, because a lot of the things that we did is we would meet weekly with various people in the community, and we would talk about all the things we were going to do. Well, the next week we'd probably have another meeting, and we'd meet with all these community people and talk about all the things that we were going to do, and they were the same things that we had met about the week before. So it just went on and on and on and on. And I just thought it wasn't a great way for anybody to be spending their time just spinning their wheels. So I had this camera that I was using in our efforts, but I started to go out at lunch and take pictures in downtown Denver. And I had a friend who was worked in advertising, making films. And so he taught me how to develop film. Then I bought some equipment, and we were living as caretakers in a church. Because Volunteers in Service to America just paid you a subsistence wage. So we had this place rent-free in the basement of a church, and we were supposed to be caretakers. And basically what we did is when kids broke in the church, we'd chase them away. But it was fine, it was free. And so I built a darkroom in this little apartment that we had. And I taught myself how to do all that stuff. And it was a funny story that we were living there. One night, this kid had broken into it was a church and a school. And this kid, I have no idea how old he was, had broken into the school, and we knew he was in there. And his dog knew he was in there too, because it was running from window to window looking for him. So I got on the loudspeaker system in the school. And I said, "Whoever's here, this is God speaking, get out of my house." And he was gone. But yeah, I really didn't like community organizing. And then we decided to move back to Milwaukee. And I got a job in a kind of a variety store, but they had a camera counter, and I started selling cameras and radios and stuff. And then I started taking classes in photography. And I went to school in photography, I think 1.5 years, 2 years. And then I got a teaching job out of Cardinal Stritch University. So that was how I developed my relationship to photography. And that was, even that had something to do with Vietnam, because the impression that those photographs made coming back from Vietnam really changed people. It wasn't an environment where today photographs are just ubiquitous. Everybody's texting and sending images of this and that. If they're standing on the corner, they're standing in front of a painting in a museum, they're taking selfies with the painting behind them. It just wasn't that way, and I think photographs, for that reason, were much more impactful. And they changed people, and they still do. but not in the way that then, because there's so many media outlets now compared to what was. I mean, there were 2 or 3 local news channels, and that was the television you had, and then there were the newspapers. Now you've got Instagram, Snapchat, and on and on and on, you know. So it was really powerful, and when I got interested in photography, it was really with the idea that I was going to make photographs about issues that concerned me, one of those being racism. So when I was still in school, I started a project which at that time was really in the heart of the ghetto, which was on 3rd and Vine, and so that was pretty funky there. And I used to drive home. I was living on the east side and I was going to school downtown. And there was a poster hanging in a pool hall, and it was in the afternoon, and it was a really famous photograph from the Olympics of Mexico City. And there were 2 sprinters named John Carlos and John Smith, and they had won the gold and silver medals. And during the playing of the national anthem, they had black gloves on, and they had raised their fists and put their heads down. In a sense, like the protests that are going on now at professional football games, but that was a big deal. I mean, they were really sort of voicing a real strong protest on a national stage about racism in this country.
So, in a previous date, you showed us a picture of the Saigon execution with Captain U2. Could you describe how that made you feel, and how that...
Well, it was shocking, first of all, because it's just such a violent image. But what it made me feel is that I don't know at that point in my life that I was afraid to die. But I was pretty sure I didn't want to kill anybody, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to get involved in that. It was just the brutality of that image was something that, I mean, I don't know if there were people that looked at that and said, oh, let's be gung-ho and let's go fight that fight. But that's not what I felt. And it wasn't even that I wanted to avoid it. It was, I didn't want my life to be used that way. And that's just the way I felt about it, that it was being used. I mean, the majority of people that went to Vietnam were poor and working class people. They were people who couldn't afford to go to college, or didn't have the grades to go to college, or weren't lucky enough to be good at a sport or something like that. And those are the folks who fought that war. And so I had the option of going to college and staying out of the draft, and I chose that.
Could you describe how that photo, or did it inspire you to start your photography career?
Later on, I wasn't. I mean, I didn't have. I mean, I wasn't interested in photography at that time. I was interested in politics. I wasn't even at that point in college. I wasn't interested in college that much. I mean, I was there. I played baseball. I did well enough to stay in school, but I really didn't get interested in education until I went to a master's program in New York. And that's because it was really hooked into what I was doing. I mean, until I started working with the camera, I was pretty unclear about what I wanted to be and do.
So, did you meet your wife in Denver or Milwaukee?
No, I met her here. We were married before I went there. How long were we married? A couple months. We were married in June and we left in August to go there.
Based on your experience in Denver, how was the transition between, like the two cities? Were they very similar, or?
I think economically they were pretty similar at the time. I think Denver is certainly grown economically. That's 1973 or 4. I think Denver is a sort of an expanding, growing city. I don't think we would describe Milwaukee that way. I think the population of Milwaukee is less than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And certainly economically, over the last 30 well, let's say 37 years. 1980 is, I think, when it was really dramatic that heavy industry started to leave here. Or factories just shut down. They weren't viable anymore. But in terms of, at that point in time, they weren't that different. Denver was a little bigger, was certainly in a nicer area. I mean, the Rocky Mountains are really beautiful and great and all that. I mean, but I think they would have been comparable cities at that point in time.
How was the racial situation in that city? Was it very?
It was more integrated. It was definitely more integrated.
Was the housing situation very similar?
I think housing here was worse. I'm pretty sure of that. And the substandard housing in Denver, well, it affected both African Americans and Latino populations. But overall, I think the housing in Denver was better.
Did you experience any, or did you see any racism in Denver?
Sure, you see it everywhere. I mean, it was pretty clear that it was more evident in the Latino community because there was a large Latino community there, and they were poorer. I mean, that was also in the era of Cesar Chavez, so there was a growing consciousness of migrant workers, Latino lives, economic injustice. And in Denver, that was really more evident in the Latino population. I was working with Latinos in my job, so I was more aware of that. And there was a pretty large black middle class in Denver. And that's where the church was, where we lived. And the reason that we were caretakers in the church is because it had been a Catholic church and parish school. And the neighborhood had transitioned to African American, and there aren't as many African American Catholics. And so really a couple months before we left, the Baptists had bought the whole facility. So the Catholic parish was no longer there. It was interesting because the priest, he was then alone in that parish, and he had taken personal responsibility. He felt it was his failing, that the parish was not doing well and losing members. And he used to call me up late at night, and I'm pretty sure he'd been drinking a bit. And he would just go on, and he was felt guilt, and felt that it was his fault. But they were funny conversations because he was just venting to this guy who was, 23 years old about his personal woes. And it was kind of sad, too. It was kind of sad that a man would take that on his shoulders, something that really had nothing to do with him. It was just a demographic shift in the neighborhood. But yeah, to have a priest be confessing to you when you're that age was an interesting experience.
So just going back to the Vietnam War, what other groups were you affiliated with?
Oh, I didn't really have any official affiliation. I mean, there were student groups. There were student groups everywhere, and there were protests that popped up everywhere, so you might go to those. But the only real organized thing that I did was actually that hunger strike. Otherwise, you would go to, there were protests all over the place all the time, so you could, if you wanted to go protest something, you could do it, But I didn't go to march in Washington, or I wasn't part of the '68 convention in Chicago or anything like that, no.
So your friends at the time, were they also participating with you?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, there was sort of a commonality, a common bond that it was just a time when there were lots of things happening. Even music, that was a time when that was the Beatles, it was the Rolling Stones, it was all of that. So that was a whole different kind of music that really sprung up in the 60s, when the Beatles came in, whenever it was, 64, I guess, they came to Yankee Stadium, I'm not sure. But it was a whole different kind of music, psychedelic music, they called it. There was Hendrix and all those people, and there was Woodstock and all kinds of rock festivals. So there was this sense, I think, on a certain segment of people of my age that was a unifying thing, that people identified with one another.
So, other than the fasting that you participated in, did you participate in any marches?
A few, not a lot.
Were you at all? Did you have any run-ins with law enforcement?
Was I arrested during a protest? No.
Did you know anybody who was?
If I do, I don't remember. So.
Did you have any big role models for you? People that you looked up to during this anti-war movement?
Muhammad Ali, certainly. I mean, even outside of his career as an athlete, I just thought he was an exceptionally courageous man. And he went against the grain, you know. He really stood up for his values, for African American values, for black Muslim values. Not that I'm any of those things, right? But I admired him for being that and doing that. Certainly Martin Luther King, I admired. There were other people in Milwaukee. There was a group called the Milwaukee 14. Several of them were priests. One was Nick Riddell, who actually I got to be friends with later in his life. And that was interesting. I was teaching a class, and I'm trying to think, it was about 1985, 1986. And it was an adult ed class. So there were, I think, 14, 15 people in this class, and this guy walked in late. And I looked at him and I said, that's one of the angriest human beings I've ever seen in my life. And so he sat down, and he had just gotten out of federal prison because he had been part of the Milwaukee 14, and they had burned draft cards. And then he subsequently went to St. Louis, and as I think as he told me this, he and three other people went into a church with guns, and were there to quote unquote liberate the church, meaning that they wanted all their money. And this was, in his mind, I guess, a radical event. And the priest there said, I don't believe you're going to shoot us, and I'm not giving you the money. And they were arrested, and he had spent 4 years in prison, the majority of it in solitary confinement. And so he came out, and he lived here. I think he died about 5 years ago. But he had been a priest, and he had been a priest, I think, primarily in the Philippines. But there were other parish priests that were involved in that. I think there was a Father Pasek that I had as a teacher at Carroll. And the church was really heavily involved in both the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement here.
Did that inspire you at all to be more associated with the church?
No, no. Those people, but not the church.
Do you have any other personal role models? Like maybe did you meet any high-up political figures during your time?
I've met them, but but not in the sense that I would stand there and be speaking with them for an extended period of time to sort of politicians, a few and far between. I think Wisconsin had an interesting history of people. Two senators that come to mind were William Proxmire and Gaylord Nelson. Gaylord Nelson, who started Earth Day, both of them were important figures in the U.S. Senate, and they came from Wisconsin. And they were Democrats, and I, for the most part, admired what they stood for as senators. I think one of the things that I perceive about the Democratic Party in Wisconsin now is that it's extraordinarily weak. And there are no, those were national figures. I mean, they were on national news. I mean, what Democrat from Wisconsin is now on national news? Well, I guess, not Scott Walker, but Paul Ryan is probably the most prominent U.S. official, from the House and Speaker of the House that we have. But in terms of prominent Democrats, we used to have a lot of them. There was a governor named Patrick Lucy that became an ambassador, I think, to Mexico. And so that was a different time in that sense. So those were kinds of politicians, and I admired civil rights leaders, King and Malcolm X and others. So politicians are hard for me to admire. In particular now, because nobody, it seems to me, functions as a politician in terms of having dialogue and with the other side, with people with different points of view. Everybody's so entrenched that they don't speak. And so we end up with this kind of political scene now that exists most prominently on Twitter, which is a joke. I mean, this is not any way to sort of carry on a meaningful dialogue about important issues that affect people, So, I mean, politicians now, I liked Bernie Sanders to a point. I thought what he was proposing was pretty unrealistic. But at least he was pushing in a direction that I could support. But my son interviewed Bernie Sanders about a month ago, right? He said he was kind of a crabby old guy. Curmudgeon is how he described him. But I think he stands for something. I think Elizabeth Warren stands for something. But there are a lot of people there who I think their primary objective in politics is to keep their job. So they see which way the wind is blowing and they adopt positions that seem to conform to that and give them the best chance of being elected.
So based off of your friends and you protesting with them, did you have any particular people that you were really close with, and were their opinions more extreme than yours, or did you share very similar?
I think my opinions are pretty far out there. Especially when I lived in New York, I worked with people that were really of like mind. I worked in a project called the New York Chinatown History Project, and so I was a photographer for them, and I think we all thought pretty much alike. I met people in New York that had been part of what would be called leftist politics in New York. And there was a group of photographers in New York in the early 50s called the Photo League, and they were a group of photographers that had a gallery, and they had classes, and they went out and did group projects in various places, like they did a thing called the Harlem Document, and sent a number of photographers to photograph in Harlem. Well, in the 50s, they were deemed a subversive organization by the House on Un-American Activities. What was it, the Committee on Un-American Activities? Joe McCarthy, McCarthyism. And so they were disbanded as an organization. So I knew people who had been part of that. And many, it destroyed some people's lives. I mean, they never worked again. And that certainly had a major impact on Hollywood. There were film directors and writers that couldn't work because they were deemed to be un-American and communists. They were supposed to be communists. And a lot of people on the East and West Coast had been, in fact, members of the Communist Party, but what that meant at that time is they were advocating things like Social Security, right? We take Social Security for granted now. The 8-day workday, lunch breaks period, which apparently people thought in the 30s that's just a radical idea. Well, that's something we take for granted. Those people were pretty influential. I mean, my work is kind of, I wouldn't call it, it's not radical, but I work with and hope that my pictures represent people that don't have as much of an opportunity to speak for themselves. So there's a picture right there of a young woman who's a refugee from Burma, who I took that a couple of years ago, and I was working with young people at Pulaski High School who are all refugees. And so I get involved in stuff like that, and that's what's important to me.
Did you ever, or going back to McCarthyism,
Mm-hmm.
did you ever clash with any pro-war advocates?
My father.
Oh, really?
Sure. And that they used to, what did they call that? The generation gap. That was the name of it, the generation gap, that there was our generation, then our parents, who had very different opinions about the rightness of the Vietnam War. And it led to a lot of conflict in families. I can recall when we were living in Denver, my parents came out, and I had a cousin who was living there, and his father came out with his wife, and we just had this major, major argument about politics at Thanksgiving, you know. And I don't know who walked out of the house, but some people did. So it was really divisive. You know, there was different feelings about. I mean, the America that we were brought up in and that they believed in was post-World War II America, and it was a pretty good time. I mean, economically, it was a really good time. I mean, we were rebuilding the world. Industries were just. I mean, things were flush, you know. It enabled people to live in this kind of little suburb called West Dallas and buy their first home. And that was really a post-war economy. And we were building a lot of weaponry that's sold all over the world. And as the 60s began and started to happen, things just changed. And I think people in my generation started to look at these things and started to have questions. And even, I mean, if we talk about, I remember that there used to be a show on television called American Bandstand with Dick Clark. Have you ever heard of that show? Okay, that was on daily for a period of time where it was just, they had various bands at the time, and then there would be kids on there dancing. It was really stupid. But my father was just appalled at these people dancing like that and saying that they were going to ruin their backs, and he just would go on and on and on because this was really new for him. It was like shocking. These kids were kind of shaking their asses, you know. And Elvis Presley, you know, all of that stuff, and it was just a whole different way of living, you know. I mean, even television began when I was like born. Right? So this was bringing a whole new world to people who used to, for entertainment, sit around radios and commiserate with whatever they would talk about. So the world became a much larger place because of all the information that was coming in, and we were seeing things and we were influenced by things, you know. I mean, I think it was the Beatles at one time wore these they were called Nehru jackets, you know, they were sort of like Indian jackets, and then all of a sudden there was this thing with Nehru suits. They were really dumb, but people wore them. So these fashion things that are now promoted all the time on the internet, I mean, you go on the internet now, you're just this deluge of advertising, right? You turn on a YouTube video and you've got something staring you can skip this in 5 seconds, etc., you know? And that's just an extension of what was beginning in the 50s, this kind of mass media, mass production stuff where your life is influenced by something outside the house, you know, where sort of family values are really compete with what's going on in the world.
So when the post-war, you know, Vietnam situation occurred, how was industry in West Dallas? Was it still,
great.
Still prosperous?
Oh, it was great.
What happened, or do you know by chance what happened to the community after it started to slowly?
It was in the 80s. It was Ronald Reagan's presidency. I don't know what year the recession was. It was probably 82. And that was a major shift. And since then, I mean, wages have not increased since 1980. For the average working person, wages have not gone up at all. So that we're in an economy now that for a vast majority of people is pretty stagnant, you know, and that has to do with economic and political decisions, but it also has to do with living in a world economy, where a lot of jobs that were here are now in China or in Mexico, where the labor is cheaper, you know. So for instance, the labor union was really strong in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Here, I think it's now 6% of the workforce is involved with the union movement. So that as a political force, that's certainly diminished. And as an economic force, it has too. So people don't have as much leverage in terms of bargaining for wages or for benefits. And as a result, people have lost those things. You know, hence we have the need for what we refer to as Obamacare. That now even that's being, you know, pushed back.
Did your family sympathize with the unions?
No,
No.
not my father, no. Oh, no. It was interesting because, no, he was a Republican through and through. I don't know if he knew why he was a Republican. It's just what he was. Probably because he was brought up in a small town, in small town Wisconsin, which still is, for the most part, Republican. And I just think that's what he grew up with and what he thought. But it never seemed to have a lot of substance. It was just what he was used to in a way. But at the same time, his brother was married to a woman who had a sister and her husband were members of the Communist Party. And he was president. I don't know whether it was chairperson or president of the Communist Party in Wisconsin. Fred Blair was his name. And so there was that kind of thing. But if my father would talk about Fred Blair, it was like there was a smell in the room. You know, his nose would just kind of go up, and you know, this was just, and that's the way communism was thought of. It was not thought of as an idea to be talked about. It was just evil. During our school day, there used to be not an advertisement, but a political announcement that was played on television, and there was a premier of the Soviet Union named Nikita Khrushchev. He was bald and he had warts, and he was not really good to look at, but there was a picture of him at the UN, and it was film footage, and he had taken off his shoe and he was pounding on the table, and there was a translation that came over the air, and it said, "This man has said that we will bury you." And so when you're a kid and you see that, you go, wow, these people want to annihilate us. Well, in actuality, that was a mistranslation. And what he was saying is, our system will bury yours, which he was also wrong about. But that's a different thing, right? It's not saying we're going to kill you. He's saying he believed that his system was superior to ours, right? Which he's entitled to do, but it didn't pan out historically to be that way. But during school, we would have drills where we would go in the basement of the school, and we'd get on the floor, we'd put our head between our knees, duck and cover in the event that there was a nuclear weapon dropped, right? Which is, when you think about it, is a joke, right? I mean, what would that have done for us if the city had been leveled, like Hiroshima or something like that? There's actually a house down the street on the corner that's got a bomb shelter, so that people lived with a fantasy, if they put a shelter in their backyard and the bomb went off, that they would somehow weather the storm. I mean, it's absurd. But what was interesting to me is the first I've been to East Europe 4 times now, all in the former Soviet Union. The first time I went there, I had an exhibit, and I was teaching street kids photography there, which was really fun. But and these were kids this was maybe 5 years after the Soviet Union fell apart, which was catastrophic for a lot of the former republics. And so I was in the Republic of Georgia, which is this tiny country on the Black Sea, and they had really, really fallen far and fast, and people were living there on average with $2 a day. So there were a lot of kids who were living in the streets, and in a lot of cases, their parents had, not because they had wanted to leave them, they had just abandoned them to go someplace to find work. So they were leaving the country. So these kids would be put in state-run orphanages or private orphanages, by and large, which are really awful. I mean, just not places we would put our dogs. So some of them would run away, and they'd end up living on the street. Well, the place that I was staying was it's called Caritas, which is a Catholic organization, and they had taken kids off the street, and they were in this really nice facility, and they had arts programming for them. So I had exchanged emails back and forth, and I got an exhibit in the capital city of Georgia, and I said I would come there and teach these kids living in that facility. So I lugged over all these cameras, and we'd go out and they'd take pictures of their shadows, and we'd go to the playground and just take pictures. It was great. But I stayed at that facility when I was there, and So I started talking with the workers in that place one night, and I started to describe to them that this thing that we did in grade school, of going in the basement, putting our heads between our legs and stuff, and they went, oh, we did the same thing. Because we were convinced that there was an evil empire on the other side of the world that was going to annihilate us. So this whole dialogue had gone on in both places that had really labeled each country as being evil, right? When in fact, the majority of people who live in both countries are not thinking about things on that level at all. I mean, do any of us sit here and think that, oh boy, I'd like to annihilate that country, right? I mean, it's crazy. But people live their lives that way and develop attitudes that they carry into adulthood. And they think politically out of issues that come from their childhood that they never questioned. It was one of the reasons I was so curious about why I wanted to go to East Europe, is I wanted to see what it was really like. And what I found out is that, by and large, they're just like we are. They want the same things. They want a family, they want to be loved, they want to have enough to eat, and they want to have a place to stay. Beyond that, it's all kind of gravy, you know. And I think that most people in the world want exactly that. And they aren't thinking about global issues like capitalism and communism and blah, blah, blah. They just want kind of a nice life where they're safe and taken care of and have children and are loved.
So I know you talked about, was it Frank Blair?
Fred Blair.
Fred Blair.
Fred Bassett Blair, yes.
Was he in fact affected by McCarthyism?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly how, but everybody who was involved in those kind of movements was, so they had problems finding work. I think that he had a bookstore someplace in downtown Milwaukee. There was another store that was downtown. It was called Toppings, and his name was Nick Topping, and it was like this store where you went in and bought little kitsch from India or whatever, candle holders and stuff, and I think he was involved in the same thing. So Milwaukee had, as I understand it, because this is really before my time, this is in the early 50s, and I'm like 4 years old or something, had a pretty large communist party. Not that it was going to take over the city, but Milwaukee had a history in the first part of the 20th century of socialist mayors. Daniel Hohn, with the Hohn Bridge, Frank Zeidler, and his brother, who I think his name was Fritz Zeidler, I'm not sure. But Frank Zeidler was elected mayor of Milwaukee as a socialist. And that didn't really end until a man named Henry Meyer was elected mayor of Milwaukee, who was a Democrat. And he was mayor for about 20 years.
Were you at all involved in any of the communist stuff in Milwaukee?
No.
No. Do you remember anything of Zeidler's term, or was it?
I was still a kid. I'm not sure when he was, when he decided not to run again. I don't know what year that was, but he continued to be a person in Milwaukee that people look towards. Well respected. He spoke a lot. He lived on Locust and 2nd Street until he died. So that's the ghetto, right? And he stayed there. He has a daughter, I think, that maybe still lives in the house. But if you ask sort of old-timers in Milwaukee, I mean, Frank Zeidler was considered a great mayor. And people credit the extensive park system we have to that sort of socialist idea, that we have really nice parks and that there are things in Milwaukee that are here because of that kind of philosophy,
So I know you said your dad was more of a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Did your mom at all sympathize?
She didn't say much.
Really?
She didn't say much. It was a man's world. Really, I mean, she never, I would imagine she voted the same way he did, but she never talked about it. She never talked about it. She probably thought a lot like him, at least on the surface. She was really quiet, so it was hard to know exactly what she thought. She didn't express herself that way very often. Sorry. But it was kind of, the man ran the household, and and it was, I don't know if you're familiar with a show called All in the Family. Do you ever see that show? Yeah. That would be a good representation of the way things were. Not so extreme, but a good representation.
Yeah. So, government in Milwaukee, back then, were you in favor of it, or were you...
You mean when we're talking about when I was a kid?
No. More of teenage years, maybe in college years.
I don't think we thought about it that much. We lived in West Dallas, right? And the division in the city is really clear. And I just don't think we were thinking about local politics in any sense. When you move away and you begin to realize, I mean, when the first time you meet an African American is on the basketball court as a sophomore in high school, that seemed normal at the time, right? But it's not. It's not. And if you go to other cities in the country, I mean, go to Atlanta, New York, Chicago, wherever, it's different here, and it's different. It's different here because of the segregation and the gross inequities in terms of education. You know, I just took pictures in a school last week where was it last week? I guess last week, where tuition there's $22,000 a year, right? And they spend $33,000 a year on each student. And then you go into Milwaukee Public Schools. Well, it ain't even close. And so at the school I was at, I took pictures in a lab that was all brand new Macs, lots of them, right? If I go into an MPS school, I'm going to go into broken down PCs that are, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that are obsolete, that have lots of problems. And so that inequity in terms of money and segregation is really clear. I mean, and we have, you know, for instance, well, I'm going off now, but I mean, this city just has a real problem with racial and economic segregation.
Were you more interested in, you know, this war conflict or racism during your...
I think I was more interested in the Vietnam War, but certainly was paying attention to and supportive of the civil rights movement.
So, as of now, like, do you have any recent political interests or involvements that you're...
Not as much. I mean, not as much. I'm more disillusioned with politics than I would have been 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so my sort of engagement with politics, economics, has to do with the work that I do in terms of photography. And the work that I exhibit. You know, I've been photographing migrant workers in Wisconsin for 4 or 5 years now. My son and I did a big exhibit in 2010 or 11 about combat veterans. So that my son, who's a journalist, interviewed 10 combat veterans from World War II to the last one was Afghanistan, but it was really the parents of somebody who was killed in Afghanistan. So what he did is we put the interviews on MP3 players, and so when we had the exhibit, I did 8 or 10 pictures of each veteran. And so that people, I don't know if you go to art exhibits, I kind of doubt that you do, but the openings generally are kind of social events. People talk and they eat cheese and drink wine, and it's mostly not about the art, it's about sort of a place to socialize. Well, because we did it and everybody got an MP3 player and had headphones on, the whole thing was quiet. And they were listening to these stories of veterans who, incredible stories, just incredible stories. And so that was, to my mind, you know, I've heard it said that a war photographer is by definition an anti-war photographer. So this was really to talk about the actual experience of veterans who have come back from conflict throughout basically my lifetime. Because I don't recall any significant period of time when this country wasn't either at war or thinking about going to war. And we haven't this is really my opinion, we really haven't won a war since World War II. We invaded this island in the Caribbean called Grenada. We won that one, but they didn't have an army. So that was a pretty easy thing to do, right? And I was never clear about why we invaded them. But we're now in Afghanistan for 16 years. 16 years. And there's just nothing to point to. We pay lip service to veterans. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. But I think it's in the 45% of the homeless people in the country are veterans, right? And so when we did this exhibit, I got the chance, I mean, he would interview them for a couple of hours, but I would spend much more time with them making pictures. I would go to their homes. There was one African-American veteran from World War II who was a member of the first unit of African-American Marines. The first African-Americans allowed to be Marines. Allowed. I mean, think about that. And he talks about coming back after being 2 years in the Pacific and going to the USO when they landed in Virginia, and there was a little stand there with coffee and donuts. And they went to the stand and they were denied service because they were black. You know? I can't remember the quote, but he said, well, we knew we were home again. And this was just a great human being. I mean, I spent a lot of time with him and we got to be friends. And he, for instance, next to his house, which is a really modest house in Harvey, Illinois, which is outside Chicago, and it's not a great place. It's kind of poor. He had this huge garden that he didn't really eat much from. He just gave the food to his neighbors. He visited veterans hospitals. He visited nursing homes. Well, he was in his 80s at this point, you know. But when we had the show in Chicago, it was both online and it was an actual exhibit, and it was near the University of Chicago, which is where Barack Obama's home is, right? And so I don't know whether he saw that it's online, somebody took it to him, or he came to the actual exhibit, but he saw this man, his picture, and listened to his story, which is a 6-minute interview. It's real touching. And invited him to the White House to honor him, which was a really great thing. So that's sort of a political statement that I make when I'm working with migrant workers and shooting photographs of them. I just think they're great people who work very, very hard just to get by, you know. And then we've got a president who's calling them rapists and criminals, when in fact the crime rate for immigrants is 1/2 of the general population. And these people are not out there committing crimes. They've got their faces in the dirt picking cucumbers. And not only the parents, but children, right? And so, legal or illegal, it doesn't even matter to me. I mean, if they don't do that work, nobody's doing that work. I mean, by law, the growers, and this is in Wisconsin, they have to advertise for people in the area to come and take those jobs. Nobody does. Nobody does. So, and the farmer, before I started this whole project, I went to him because I can't go out in his fields and take pictures of people working for him without his permission. And he said, please do it. He said, and this is a very conservative man, certainly a Republican. He said, if these people aren't in these fields and in these slaughterhouses, we don't eat. And that's really true. The food industry in this country is really manned by immigrant labor, primarily Mexican. You know, my daughter's a chef in New York. A lot of the kitchen help in that kitchen is Mexican. The people who pick the food are Mexican. The people who work in the slaughterhouses are Mexican. And people either have the insensitivity or gall to call them rapists. You know? And so I exhibit those pictures. I talk about them. And I say the same things I'm saying to you. I mean, I've learned a lot from them. The sort of we talk about family values a lot, but the sort of bond that those people have with one another is just amazing and far beyond most what I would call American families. You know, they really take care of one another. There are I knew two young women who came up with their mother from Texas. They're really beautiful kids. They were juniors and seniors in high school. The last thing they wanted to be doing is being out in those fields, being in the dirt, but out of loyalty to their mother, they're out there picking and working hard. One of them's now in college and she's in the Army Reserve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this person has come up with that childhood and is doing what most people would be consider admirable, right? Going to college, working her way through college, being in the Army Reserve, minding her own business, also working a job. What more do people want before the end to the name calling can happen?
So in a previous state, you actually mentioned Jeremy Armstrong.
Right.
Could you describe a little bit his life and maybe how that relates to?
How it relates to my photography, etc. It was. I'm trying to figure out the exact dates now. My son's 38, so he was in 8th grade. So what year does that put us at? You would have been in 8th grade. You're what, 14, 13?
Yeah, you're roughly. No, I would say you're.
So 25 years ago.
13 years.
Yeah. Okay, so he was in 8th grade, and he went to a school, Roosevelt Middle School, which is on 9th and Walnut. And he came home from school one day, and at that time, gun violence in Milwaukee was probably at a level, it's pretty bad now, but it was at a similar, if not the same level at that point. So he rode a yellow school bus back and forth to school. So he came home one day and he said, "Hey, Dad, somebody shot at my school bus today." Well, I was in the middle of doing something, so I sort of half heard it, right? And I didn't pay much attention then. I heard it, like 10 seconds later, I said, "What?" And somebody had, in fact, come out on the front porch and shot at his bus. And so I thought that maybe I could explore that whole thing with photographs and talking to people, which I did. And I got a couple grants, and so I proceeded. The first person I photographed and interviewed was the mother of a young man named Marcus DeBack. And there's a park in Milwaukee now named after him. And he was 8 years old, I think. And he was on a playground. It's on 55th and Wright. And there was a basketball game on the opposite side of the playground, and somehow there had an argument about the game. And somebody had gone to their car, gotten a gun, and started to shoot. Well, Marcus DeBack grabbed the hand of like a 4-year-old kid and was trying to get him off the playground, and he got shot in the back of the head and died. I saw the x-ray of it. The bullet entered in the back, and you could just see this thing going, and it ends up right here. So I photographed her and talked to her about, and she had been involved after that in sort of anti-gun things, anti-violence things. And then I proceeded from there to interview doctors, lawyers, young men who had killed people, young men who were in wheelchairs as a result of being shot. And so one of the lawyers that I talked to had a client, and his name was Jeremy Armstrong, and he had been a student at Mesmer High School, and he was headed to be valedictorian. And his father had been injured, was a roofer, got injured in an accident, had fallen off a roof, and started with Vicodin for the pain, and it escalated, and was a crack addict. And so he had spent their money on crack. And they didn't have heat, and they didn't have lights, and he was studying by the light of a Coleman lantern. Because he still, in spite of these sort of really bad things going on in his life, wanted to maintain his grades because he wanted to be valedictorian, he wanted to go to college and all those things. So he got it in his head that he would rob the drug dealer. And so he went and got a gun, and he pointed it at the drug dealer, and he told him to give him his money. And the guy laughed at him, and either slapped him with money or just slapped him. Well, when he did, he turned his head and he pulled the trigger. And as he was doing that, the drug dealer was reaching out like that for the gun, and the bullet went under here and went through his heart. and Jeremy Armstrong was 15. So I don't know if he was prosecuted by the county or the district attorney, but they refused to waive him back to juvenile court and try him as a juvenile, so they tried him as an adult. And there's testimony online from that. And he testifies as on behalf when they sentenced him. He was just this kid, and he was just so scared. But they sentenced him to 20 years. So I had met his attorney, and she told me about him, and then we arranged for me to go and see him in prison. And he was in Green Bay. And Green Bay, not that prisons are supposed to be resorts, but it's a pretty awful place. It's over 100 years old, and it's overcrowded. And he was there. He was 16 at the time. And so I met him, and I was just floored because he wasn't even shaving yet. So he looked like a baby, you know, and he had this funny haircut where it just stuck up like a porcupine. And the picture I took of him, you can see it's just a silhouette because he didn't want his face showing, so he's standing against these bars and all his hair sticking up in the air. But I just started to talk to him, and he told me this story. And he also told me that when he got to prison, that I believe it's Dodge County Correctional Facility, where the prisoners, people who are going and have long sentences, they go there and essentially get trained in how to be a prisoner. And so they told him, and as they would anybody else, that you can't sort of take anything from anyone. In other words, you can't take abuse from, you can't take name calling, none of that. You've got to fight back. So he was there a really short time, maybe the first week, and somebody in the cafeteria called him a bitch. And he took his lunch tray, and he walked up to the guy and smacked him across the face with it. And for that, they put him for 73 days in solitary confinement. So that's tough. That's really tough. And at the time, you had the choice of it either being light all the time or dark all the time in the cell. So he told me that he used to lay at the door of the cell and look underneath it because there was some light there, and he waited for somebody to walk by, so he was convinced that there was somebody else alive in the world. And that's, I mean, people go crazy in that amount of time being alone. So we had him over for dinner. I think it was last summer, right? And he, when I met him, he was committed to getting out of prison and going to college. Now, you know, you sort of think, is that really going to happen? But he did it. And I think he had served 9 years. And the last time I had any contact with him, I had written a letter in support of his parole. And then I was teaching a college class, and I was telling him this story about this guy. I didn't mention him by name or whatever, and they said, "Oh, Mr. Armstrong, is that who you're talking about?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Oh, he teaches at Mesmer." So he got out of prison after was paroled. I don't remember what kind. He worked as a plumber's assistant because that's what he was doing in prison. He said that he was a plumber's assistant because he figured that if you're a plumber or a plumber's assistant and you're working, nobody really cares what your background is. All they care about is if you unplug their toilet or fix their pipes or whatever. So he figured he had thought that out, that's the way he could make a living once he got out. And so that's what he was doing, and then he went to college. He went to Cardinal Stritch, got a degree, got a certificate, and is teaching at Mesmer, which is a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. Because most people, the recidivism rate for prisoners is, I think, at 60%. People get out and they go back. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I mean, their whole day is so regimented there that people get used to that, you know, and they forget how to take care of themselves. And they're scared to take care of themselves. And so they go back, they commit a crime, and there are a lot of mentally ill people in prison. So it's sort of a mental hospital too, you know. But where was I going with it? Oh, my wife, we had him over for dinner, and she, he's still committed. He's a committed Catholic, right? And she said, after all that's happened to you, how can you still believe that? And he said, well, when I was in solitary confinement, there was a little crack where the window was. And he said, at night, I just used to look out there, and sometimes I saw a star, and I was convinced that that star was mine. And that's how I hung on to it. So, pretty amazing story. So that's the story of Jeremy Armstrong.
So was Jeremy Armstrong, was he African American?
No, he's white.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Based off of your experience with the African American community, though, do you think that race relations have been better in Milwaukee since back then, or?
If so, not much. Certainly people are there's now a middle-class African-American community here. Certainly not as large as a lot of other places, but it's here. But the segregation, I don't know if we're still defined as the most segregated city in the country, but we're near the top of that list, right? There are, there are studies that come out of UWM. I think the unemployment rate for African American males in Milwaukee is over 50%. That's obscene, right? When you think about it, if you think about a country, if you thought about a country, let's say we talk about Denmark, and there's an African American population there. And you say, 58% of them are unemployed. Well, you think, what's wrong with that place? And I think the same thing can be said for here. What's wrong with here that this goes on? I've done work in a lot of inner city schools. And one was North Division. And they did a study out of UWM where 78% of the adults in that community had no marketable skills. Nothing. How does that happen? I think those are questions that at least need to be asked. And I'm asking it, but I'm a small voice. Nobody's listening to me. I remember when after I did this big exhibit on gun violence that traveled a lot of places, and one of them being City Hall. The first time it was there 2 days. And there was the mayor remained unnamed, but they were big interviews. They were on these big things, and it was very, very critical of him. And so I put it up. I spent the whole weekend putting it up there, and I got a call Monday afternoon, you got to take it down. The mayor doesn't want it here. And they made up this thing. They said it was a fire hazard, but it wasn't. But I don't know whether it was a year or so later they asked for it to come back, and so they put it up then. But then they somehow thought that because I'd done this exhibit and, I got interviewed on television and radio and all that, and that I was an expert on gun violence. Well, I wasn't. I knew some things, and I probably knew more than the average person, but I certainly wasn't an expert, and they put me on this committee to address gun violence in Milwaukee. So I went to a meeting and I sat there and they kept talking about how bad the kids were. What's wrong with these kids? What's wrong with these kids? And one of the things that I found out in doing this work, that there wasn't really much at all wrong with these kids. They were in really bad circumstances, or had been in situations that precipitated snap decisions that affected the rest of their lives. But I didn't at all view it as a problem of bad young people, quote unquote, bad young people. And I said in the meeting, I said, it's not their problem, it's yours. And I said, they live in a city where this stuff goes on, and you're responsible for how this city exists and goes on, and the economic well-being of this city and the education of this city. Those kids aren't making that decision. They didn't invite me back. And that's the way I feel. I mean, how can you ask a 15-year-old kid, what's he going to do about being in a substandard school? And there are lots of them here. I mean, I've worked in a high school where 5% of the kids are reading at grade level, 5%. What's going to happen to those people? I mean, if you can't read, what can you do? I mean, and you're just guessing the other 5% don't read at all. I think this city has significant problems, and I don't have the answers to those, but I think they really have to be looked at in a more open way, and not keep pretending that they don't exist. It's the fourth poorest city in the country for children. I don't know if this statistic still holds, but at one time our test scores for math and science in public schools here were the second lowest in the country, and the only other city that was lower was Detroit. So there are big problems here that to me are just ignored. And I may be wrong about that. I know there are people out there working and doing the best they can to address these problems, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. And I think if this city is to sort of think of itself and go on as kind of a first-rate city, that you can't ignore that stuff. So I don't have the answer. I do my little things. And I think I help some kids sometimes. But I also have worked with kids who I thought were great kids, you know. And I can think of 2 of them who are in prison. So it's significant problems that really need major investment of both money and people.
Well, we're about to wrap up here. Do you have any things you want to say, or any things we left out?
No, I think it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.